Up until now, I've reviewed nearly the entire line of CR10 printers from Creality, but today I'd like to take a first look at a different kind of printer, the Xinkebot Orca2 Cygnus. It's quite a name. GearBest.com sent this to me for free to review on my channel, but my opinions are my own. With a build volume of 400 by 400 by 500 millimeters in the vertical, it's similar in print volume to the Creality CR10S4, but it's different in a number of ways, not the least of which is the price, which is considerably higher. Do features like a touchscreen and auto bed leveling make it worth paying more than twice as much for this printer as the CR10S4? Well, let's see. Now, I'm not going to do a full unboxing of the machine, but here are some of the highlights. I will say that it's very well packed, and the packing materials seem higher in quality than the other printers I've unboxed. The parts come in a number of smaller boxes, so of course you do have to do a fair amount of assembly. I would say that it's a bit more difficult to assemble than a CR10, but not much more. And Xinkebot has a full tutorial video online showing you what to do. Here we have the touchscreen, which attaches to the side of the printer. We'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. And here is the single extruder module. Now this has the capability of using a double extruder as well, although this version that I'm unboxing here only came with the single extruder. Here we have the heat bed and a couple of sheets of their version of build tack. And then there's the actual printer body itself. They're actually pretty generous with the accessories that they include in the set. So there's a USB cable, which I've never actually used, various spare parts. Here's the auto bed leveling sensor, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. A full-sized SD card. These are some braces that you use in assembling the machine, some extra sensors, and a full set of these Allen wrenches, which is kind of interesting. You don't actually need most of these, but you need several of them. And finally, we have a full-sized roll of fairly nice PLA filament. One thing they didn't include is any kind of scraper, which is unusual because most every printer I've unboxed has come with something to get the prints off the bed. Once you get the entire thing assembled, this is what you get, and I'll have to say it looks quite good. It's made of 4040 aluminum extrusion, so it's quite thick, these metal bars that make up the frame, thicker than the CR10 range of printers, for example. And especially compared to the CR10, I like that it has everything attached to the frame. It's all one unit. The screen there does sort of stick out the side, but there's no control box that's tethered by cables, which is one of the things I really don't like very much about the CR10. This is the included spool holder, and it works just fine for the included filament, but as it turns out, it basically doesn't fit any of the other filament that I have. It's just a little bit too narrow, so yeah, it's not a great solution. You're going to have to find some kind of external spool holder, or you can do what I did, which is to print a spool holder that fits on top of the machine. There's one here that was specifically made to slot into 4040 extrusions like the Xinkebot is made of. This design that fits on the top of the printer works really well, and it keeps you from having to have a spool holder on either side of the machine, which takes up a lot more room. So I'm a little surprised that they didn't supply something like this with it, but it's not a big deal to have to print your own. One feature I do really like is the touchscreen. It's a little bit on the small side, but it is quite responsive when you touch it. I'm just going to go through some of the menus here to give you an idea. It does have a Wi-Fi item here, which is actually non-functional as far as I can tell. But you can go in and change a number of the settings. You can do things like preheat the nozzle or manually control the hot end moving, things like that. And compared to using the scroll wheel interface on something like the CR10, it's a lot easier to use and allows you to get to a lot of these features a lot more easily. To start a print, you just push the print button and select the file you want to print. It does show files other than G-code files, which can be a little confusing sometimes. And then you press the play button there to actually start it. You can do a number of things while it's printing. You can adjust the various settings and things, temperature. If you press the pause button, it'll ask if you want to replace the filament. And replacing filament on here is super easy, much easier on this than on any other printer I've used, actually. Partially that's because of the way the extruder is. It's just very easy to get the filament out, but also it's easy to pause and resume. You can press the stop button there if you actually want to stop, and then it'll ask you if you want to save a breakpoint, which allows you to actually turn the printer off and then resume a print later on, theoretically. I've never actually had the need to do that. This should also be possible if the printer loses power for some reason. You can resume where it left off. One thing it does not have, though, is a filament sensor, so it can't tell if the filament runs out. It does have a port on the main control box that's labeled filament, and apparently you can use that with a third-party filament sensor, but you have to get that yourself and also get some sort of updated firmware from Xinkebot. It seemed a little involved, and I haven't actually explored that very much, but maybe it is possible to add one. The hot end and the extruder are actually part of a self-contained module that attaches with magnets, and you just have to undo that cable at the top there if you want to swap out for maybe another nozzle size, or if you have the dual extruder module, you could swap that out. It is a direct drive extruder, so the filament goes down directly into the extruder and then into the hot end, which I find actually quite a bit easier to use than a Bowden setup like on the CR10. It's just easier to load the filament and unload it, and easier to use flexible filaments, I think. One other nice feature is that when you actually turn on the printer, you'll see there's an LED light strip incorporated into this module, so you can see what you're printing more easily. I understand that some versions of this printer come with both the dual and single extruder modules. This one, as I said, only came with the single extruder, so that's what I'm going to be reviewing today. But I'm going to see if I can get one of those dual extruder modules as well, and maybe do a follow-up review about that at some point in the future. One of the things I was most interested in about this printer was the auto bed leveling feature. Now, this is the bed leveling sensor, which is a separate thing that attaches by magnets. And when you want to actually level the bed, which you don't have to do every time, you do it periodically, you attach it there with the magnets. Make sure you got it facing the right direction. There we go. And select the level option in the menus. And then it'll go through and hit a few dozen points on the bed and presumably record minute differences in elevation there, so that it can compensate for that while it's printing. It takes probably about a minute or two to do this, but as I say, you don't have to do it all that often. And here you can see during a print that the Z-axis rods will move slightly to compensate for those differences in bed level. One of the major frustrations for me in using the CR10 is the bed leveling process. I'm pretty good at it by now, but it's still something that you have to worry about for almost every print. And having it automatically taken care of like this is nice. However, it's not totally automatic as I thought it would be. You still have to manually adjust the distance from the nozzle to the heat bed using this little turn knob here that is connected to a spring, which sort of changes the height of this end stop here. If you don't get this right, then your print's just not going to work at all. It either won't stick or it won't come out. And it's actually kind of difficult to get this exactly right, but you don't have to adjust it very often. The first time I tried printing the included sample file, I had a bit of a problem in that the nozzle rammed itself into the heat bed and basically ruined the build surface right away. And I'm not entirely sure what the problem was here. I think I had followed all the instructions as I should have, and it still didn't work properly until I started slicing my own files. Now, I'm not a huge fan of these build surfaces anyway, because I find that it makes it very difficult to remove small amounts of filament, and since this one was ruined already, I decided to just go ahead and remove it and use the glass underneath. Now, luckily, it is borosilicate glass underneath there, and it seems to be nice and flat. However, it is rather challenging to get the existing build surface off of there because it leaves a lot of adhesive behind. I ended up using some Goo Gone and just letting it soak for a little bit, and that took it off relatively easily. Once I had the adhesive off, I just used it more or less the way I've been using the CR10s, with some glue stick on the bare glass, and that's been working fairly well, I think. Unlike the CR10, which has a 12-volt heat bed, this has a 24-volt heat bed, which means that it heats up quite fast, generally speaking. I haven't done any real measurement of it, but I haven't found myself having to wait around very much for it. I decided to use this bust of Harrison Ford as Han Solo as a test print. This is by Toshi TNE from Thingiverse, and it's just a fantastic sculpt. I printed this at a 0.15 millimeter layer height, and at a relatively fast speed of 5,000 millimeters per second, and so I think actually I could have improved the quality a bit by making it more slow. You can see there's some ringing in the face here that I think could be improved, but other than that, it looks pretty good. I'd like to come back and maybe try reprinting this one later on. After trying a few test prints to zero in on my settings, I was thinking about what I wanted my first major print to be, and it occurred to me that the squid attack model would be just about perfect for this printer because it's a tall and very detailed model that should just about perfectly fill the build volume. I use Simplify 3D for just about everything, and normally slicing a model only takes a few seconds, but this one ended up taking like a couple of hours or something ridiculous to slice, and it brought my computer nearly to its knees. And this meant that I wasn't able to fully preview the sliced model like I usually do, and I usually like to go through and check that the supports are in the proper places and things like that. This model that I'm using here has some integrated supports that are part of the model itself and not from the slicer. And it turned out that they basically, for whatever reason, were not even touching the model in most places, so they didn't really support it at all. And when you think of it that way, it's amazing that it printed as well as it did. But there was some drooping in places where the supports weren't touching it, or a couple places the supports fell off. I printed this at 0.2 millimeter layer height, and it took around 1 week to finish, which is crazy long. Now, it did have a fair amount of infill, as you could see there, and I did that just because there's so much detail on here that I wanted to make sure that it was all supported properly. And also, I turned down the print speed a fair amount just to ensure that we had good quality throughout the print. Probably could have gone faster than that, quite frankly, and cut at least a couple days off the print time, but I wanted to see sort of what the maximum that this printer was capable of. And I think it did really, really well. This is one of the most impressive prints that I've made, actually. I used 3D Solutech Silver PLA for this, and printed at 220 degrees Celsius. For this print in particular, the lack of a filament sensor was a bit of a problem. It took at least a couple of rolls of filament, I don't recall exactly how much, but I had to always sort of be monitoring whether I had enough filament left. I remember at one point, 4 or 5 days into the print, that I actually had a nightmare about running out of filament, so yeah, maybe I should look into getting a sensor. Next up we have a Gamorrean Guard bust from Build It and They Will Come. This was a thing they offered to their subscribers as an additional purchase you could get if you wanted to, so it's not freely available, but it is quite a good model. As usual, it was available in several different versions. There's the full head, one that's cut up in many small pieces, and then one that's cut up in 3 pieces. Because of the shape of this model, I decided to do the one that was split into 3 parts. I thought this would eliminate the need to use so much support material and help it print better. I'm not entirely sure that this was the best choice to make because I could have done this all in one go if I had wanted to. I did have some issues with this print, actually. One of them was some warping on the bed, I believe, because when I tried to put the pieces together and assemble them, they didn't quite fit flush as they should. I think maybe this is an example where having the build surface would actually come in handy and prevent some of that. Another issue I had was that during the print, and this is sort of a related issue, I think, the supports came loose from one of the pieces and ended up kind of messing up the inside of the print. You can see I actually used some duct tape here to try and keep the supports from moving around as much. You could also use something like hot glue. In the end, it worked out okay. The supports did their job well enough that it didn't fail, and it's just on the inside of the piece where this was a problem. So on the finished piece, You can't actually see it from the outside, but if you turn it around, it gets a little furry inside there where the supports failed. But it actually came out fine once I removed the support material there. The other issue I had is pretty obvious on this piece, especially when you have the light from the hot end shining down on it. There's a lot of sort of ribbing or banding on the smooth portions of the print, and I am not entirely sure what is causing this. I had it on a few other prints as well, but not on all of them. I think it may be settings related. One other minor issue I had, I was printing this at 235 degrees centigrade because it's Maker Geek's nuclear green, which recommends 235. But it seemed like the hot end had trouble maintaining that temperature. You can see here it's all the way down to 224 now of 235, which really shouldn't happen. And here you can see the assembled piece, and some of the problems that I mentioned earlier are obvious. There are some cracks, and this is the best I could do even with sanding, and I even used a heat gun in a couple of places to try and sort of bend it together a little bit better, and it just didn't come together as I had hoped. Now obviously if you're doing a multi-part piece like this, you're probably going to be sanding and finishing and painting and everything, so it's not a huge deal, but still. And you can also see these ribs or bands that I was mentioning as well. So I would say this is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how well this model turned out, but it looks quite good from a reasonable distance. You may have seen this one in my life-size Jabba the Hutt video that I made recently. I was wearing it as a mask. You can't actually do that when it's fully assembled, but if you don't put the back on, you can wear it as a sort of mask with no eye holes. Lastly, I wanted to try printing in some flexible filament. This is regular PLA here. You can see it's very kind of springy, and if you bend it very much, it will snap. But this is flexible filament, TPU, and you can just wrap it around your finger and it comes right back. It's just like rubber. I've never really used flexible filament before, partially because I had the idea that it was difficult to print with, and that can be especially true with a Bowden setup like we have on the CR10, although I've seen people using it successfully on that as well. But I thought, given that this is a direct drive extruder, it shouldn't be too difficult to use something like TPU, and it turned out actually quite well. You need to turn off retraction when you're using it, and so we're getting some strings there in the middle, but it doesn't show up on the outside of the print at all. And once you're done, you have what looks more or less like a regular print, but is actually soft and squishy like a rubber ball, which is actually really cool. If you're on my Instagram, you may have seen this model. It's a Santa Porg that I posted around Christmas time. This I didn't print on this printer, I printed it on the CR10 Mini. But I decided to take this same model and print it in flexible filament, just to see what would happen. The first time I tried this, I ended up having a little bit of a hole here on the top where it didn't quite fill in because this is hollow, so I tried it again with more top layers this time, and it came out just about perfectly. You probably don't want to print something that requires a lot of support material with this flexible filament, but you can actually use some supports, and in fact this next model that I tried, which is my Jabba model, does require a little bit in the way of supports, and it came out really well. This one I printed with some infill instead of doing it completely hollow, and it's pretty firm, but it feels almost like a rubber action figure, which I thought was really cool. But I decided also to print one hollow just to see how that would turn out, and from the outside it's not too different. I had some more stringing on this one for some reason, but you can see it's just very flexible. So I'd like to try experimenting with flexible filament some more in the future, maybe doing some masks or something. I'm calling this a first look review rather than a final review because I don't feel like I've had the chance to fully put this through its paces, and some of the problems, like I had with the Gamorrean guard bust, I feel are probably related to my settings, so if I can hone those in a little bit better, I imagine that I won't have any quality issues with this printer. So I'm fairly confident that the quality of the printer is good, and it has a lot of nice convenience features like the auto bed leveling, but the real question we have to ask is about the price, because this is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the review, more than double the price of a similar CR10 model. And is it really worth that? Well, I think it might be worth looking at some similar models that are not in the CR10 range. In fact, this is kind of a clone of the G-Max printer from G-Create, and the G-Max, if you look on their website, actually retails for nearly $3,000, and that's without a heated bed. The MakerBot Replicator Z18 printer, which was kind of what that Squid Attack model I printed was designed to show off, I think, costs $6,499, and that's also without a heated bed. And well, that's just crazy. But the point is that there are similar printers that go for a lot more, and it's really only because the CR10 came in suddenly and was so cheap that this starts to look expensive. Also, a lot of CR10 owners spend a lot of money upgrading their printers, adding things like auto bed leveling and better heat beds and extruders and so forth. And if you're going to spend all that money on upgrading the CR10, I think this might actually be a better choice. But if you're going to be using it stock, I'd probably still recommend the CR10 S4, just based on price alone. Of course, one thing to keep in mind when thinking about this versus the Creality line of printers is that there's a huge online community for Creality CR10 users, and very little for Xinkebot users at this point. In fact, this is, I think, the first full video review on YouTube, but maybe that'll change if more people start buying these. I did have the opportunity to talk via email to the support team at Xinkebot, who did not know that I was doing a review of this, by the way, and they were very helpful on several occasions, so that is good. As I mentioned, I'm going to be trying to get a dual extruder module for this printer, and I plan to make a second follow-up video later on that will include some of my thoughts about using this for a longer period of time, and also just how the dual extruder module works as well. So keep an eye out for that in the future. In the meantime, you can click the link in the video description below to see the product page for this on gearbest.com. And there is a coupon code there as well if you should decide to purchase. Thanks for watching.